They tried to
She
remove
never
this
looked at
black
the
family from the
eyes.
plane. Moments later, regret.
The tickets.
ACT-1, the explosive hook. She didn't even look at their tickets. That's the first thing you need to understand about what happened on Flight 2247 out of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport on a Tuesday morning that started like any other and ended like nothing anyone on that plane would ever forget. She didn't look at the tickets. She looked at them. And in the half-second it took for her eyes to move from the family standing in the aisle to the seats they were walking toward, something shifted in her face. A tightening around the jaw. A subtle squaring of the shoulders. The kind of shift that people who have never had to notice it would probably miss entirely. But the boy noticed. He was 11 years old, and his name was Marcus, and he noticed everything. He noticed it the same way he noticed the way the gate agent had paused just a half-beat too long when his mother handed over their boarding passes. The same way he noticed the couple 3 rows back who had stopped pretending to look at their phones and were now watching openly. He noticed it the way children notice things when they've learned, earlier than any child should have to learn, that the world sometimes looks at their family differently, and that the difference is not always something you can explain to someone who hasn't felt it. His mother's name was Diane Whitfield, and if you had been standing in that jetway watching her walk onto that plane, you would have seen a woman in her early 40s, dressed neatly in a dark blazer, her natural hair pinned back carefully, moving with the quiet and deliberate grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of taking up exactly the right amount of space. Not too much. Never too much. Behind her walked Marcus, his backpack straps pulled tight, his eyes already doing that slow scan of the cabin that his mother had told him more than once made him look like a little old man. And behind Marcus walked Imani. She was 7. She was wearing a headband with 2 large pom-poms on it, one purple and one gold, and she was holding a stuffed elephant named Gerald, and she was completely unaware that anything in the world could possibly be wrong, because nobody had told her yet that sometimes the world looks at you and decides, before you've said a single word, that you don't belong somewhere. That education was coming. But not today. Today, Diane was going to make sure of that. Their seats were 14A, 14B, and 14C. Window, middle aisle. Diane had booked them 3 weeks in advance. She had the confirmation email on her phone, the boarding passes printed as backup, and the digital copies saved in 2 separate apps, because Diane Whitfield did not leave things to chance. She never had. She couldn't afford to. She reached row 14. She began to slide toward the window seat. That's when the flight attendant appeared. Her name tag said Carol. She was somewhere in her 50s, with the particular kind of brisk efficiency that comes from 2 decades of moving people through small spaces, and her smile, the professional one she had probably used 10,000 times, was not quite all the way on when she stopped at the end of row 14 and looked at Diane with an expression that was almost but not quite a question. "Can I help you find your seats?" Diane looked up, calm, patient, the particular patience of someone who has learned to recognize a test when it's being given. "We're in 14A, B, and C," she said. Carol looked at the row. Then she looked at Diane. Then she looked, almost imperceptibly, at the rest of the family. Then back at the row. "These seats are taken," she said. Diane blinked. Just once. "I'm sorry. These seats," Carol repeated, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the people in rows 13 and 15, "are already assigned to other passengers." Diane reached into her jacket pocket. She pulled out the printed boarding passes. She held them out. Carol did not take them. "You'll want to speak with someone at the gate," Carol said instead. "There may have been a mix-up with your booking." The word "your" landed the way Carol probably intended it to, like a small stone dropped into still water, like a suggestion, like a door being gently, firmly closed. Diane did not move. Marcus, standing in the aisle with his backpack on, looked at his mother's back. He looked at the boarding passes in her hand. He looked at Carol, and he thought, she didn't even check. She didn't look at the tickets. She looked at them. And now a plane full of people were about to find out exactly what that choice was going to cost her. If you want to see justice done right and stories told with real power, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next on this plane is going to stay with you. Welcome to the channel. Let's get into it. What would you have done in Diane's position? Stayed calm or spoken up immediately? Drop it in the comments below. Warning: Act 2, pressure rising. Here is something most people don't understand about staying calm when someone is being unjust to you in public. It is not weakness. It is not submission. It is not the absence of anger. It is the mastery of anger. It is taking every single feeling rising inside your chest and compressing it into something controlled, something precise, something that cannot be used against you later. Because that's the other thing most people don't understand. When you are a black woman standing in the aisle of a crowded airplane and a flight attendant is telling you that your confirmed seats somehow belong to someone else, you are not only navigating the situation in front of you, you are navigating every possible version of how this situation could go wrong. Raise your voice, you become the problem. Show frustration. You confirm what some of them already decided about you before you opened your mouth. Cry, you get dismissed. Demand, you get escorted out. So Diane Whitfield stood in the aisle of Flight 2247 with her printed boarding passes in her outstretched hand and her voice at exactly the same controlled register it had been at when she ordered coffee at the gate that morning, and she said, with the kind of clarity that comes not from shouting but from absolute certainty, "My boarding passes say 14A, B, and C. We've been checked in since this morning. I'd like to speak with a supervisor." Carol's smile shifted. "Not much. Just enough." "I understand your frustration," Carol said. And the word frustration did its usual work, reframing a legitimate objection as an emotional overreaction before Diane had expressed a single strong emotion. "But the system may be showing a double booking, and I'd just ask that you step back toward the front of the plane while we sort this out." "I don't need to step back," Diane said. "I need to sit down in my confirmed seats." The man in 15A, mid-40s, collared shirt, laptop bag, had stopped pretending to read. He was watching now with the careful attention of someone trying to determine which side he was on before he committed. The woman in 13B had already pulled out her phone. It was not entirely clear, yet, whether she was recording to help or recording for other reasons. That ambiguity is important. Remember it. Marcus had moved slightly to the left in the aisle, not blocking, not confrontational, but repositioning. His mother had once told him that in situations like this, his job was to be invisible but present, to not give anyone a reason to escalate toward him, but to stay close. He understood what that meant. He had understood it for longer than she probably knew. Imani, wedged between Marcus and the seat backs, had no idea anything was wrong. She was quietly making Gerald the elephant wave at a toddler 2 rows forward who was peeking over his seat back. The toddler waved back. It was the only uncomplicated thing happening in that section of the plane. Carol took a small breath. Then she did something that shifted the entire energy in that cabin. She looked past Diane. She looked at the passengers already seated in the rows nearby, not addressing them, not speaking to them, just performing a kind of silent consultation, as if to say, "You see what I'm dealing with, right?" It was the move of someone who expected the room to be on her side, who had, perhaps, never had reason to doubt that it would be. That silent check around the cabin. That moment of assumed alliance. Marcus saw it. He filed it away. What Carol did not notice, what she perhaps could not have anticipated, was that the woman in 13B had definitely started recording. And unlike Carol's silent appeal to the room, this woman's loyalties were already clear. She had watched the whole thing from the moment the family entered her row's sight line. She had seen Diane's hand extended with the boarding passes. She had seen Carol not take them. She had heard the word frustration. Her name, it would later turn out, was Priya. She was a litigation attorney from Decatur. She had 37 years of experience reading rooms and recognizing when someone was being set up. And she was furious. But she kept recording quietly, because she was also smart enough to know that the most powerful thing she could do right now was wait. Back in the aisle, things were escalating. A second flight attendant, younger, visibly uncertain, had materialized near the galley and was now watching Carol with the expression of someone trying to figure out whether to intervene or stay out of it. His name tag said Derek. He was maybe 26, maybe 27. He had the posture of someone new enough to the job that he still believed the system around him was generally fair, but experienced enough to have started having small quiet doubts about that belief. Carol had turned slightly toward him, not quite asking for backup. She didn't seem like someone who asked for things, but signaling an expectation of support. Derek looked at Diane. He looked at her boarding passes, still extended, still unexamined. He didn't move. "Is there a supervisor available?" Diane repeated. She had not lowered her arm. She had not put the boarding passes away. This, too, was intentional. As long as she held them out, The refusal to look at them was visible to everyone watching. She was not performing distress. She was creating a record. "I can call the gate supervisor," Derek said, before Carol could respond. It was a small thing. A tiny fracture in the united front Carol had been trying to project. But Diane heard it. Priya heard it. Marcus definitely heard it. Carol heard it too. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That won't be necessary," Carol said. And then, lowering her voice just slightly, just enough to imply that what she was about to say was a concession and a kindness both. "Look, I'm not trying to make this difficult, but I need you to understand that if there has been a booking error, the airline's policy is to resolve it at the gate, not once boarding is complete. So I need to ask your family to step off the plane while we confirm." The cabin was very quiet now. Diane looked at Carol for a long moment. Then she looked at Marcus. And something passed between them in that look. Something wordless and practiced and ancient in its own way. The shorthand of a mother and son who had navigated enough of these moments together that they didn't need to speak to communicate. "I see it too," Marcus's eyes said. "What do you want to do?" Diane looked back at Carol. "We're not stepping off this plane," she said. And from just behind her left shoulder, so quiet that only the people in the nearest 2 rows could hear it, Marcus said something. Not to Carol, not to the cabin, almost to himself, except not quite. He said, "She hasn't looked at the tickets." 6 words. Calm as a classroom, quiet as a library. Carol turned and looked at the boy for what was actually the first time since the family had entered her section of the plane. And for just a fraction of a second, barely anything, barely a flicker, something moved across her face that wasn't annoyance and wasn't authority and wasn't professional composure. It was something closer to uncertainty. If you're watching this and you know someone who needs to see this story, share it right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it before the next act, because the moment that's coming will hit different if you've been here from the start. Have you or someone you know ever been in a situation like this, where you did everything right and still got treated like you didn't belong? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. ACT 3. Public humiliation peak. There are moments in public confrontations where the thing that everyone in the room is actually thinking becomes impossible to ignore anymore. Where the polite fiction that this is just a logistical misunderstanding, just a routine boarding issue, just a simple administrative mix-up, collapses under the weight of everything that's actually happening. That moment came on flight 2247 at approximately 9:47 in the morning, and it came not because anyone raised their voice or made an accusation or used a specific word that couldn't be taken back. It came because of what Carol did next. Because when Marcus said, quietly, "She hasn't looked at the tickets," when that 11-year-old boy said the plainest, truest, most unanswerable thing that anyone had said in the last 4 minutes, Carol did not look at the tickets. She looked at him. And then she turned back to Diane and said, in a voice that had traded its professional smoothness for something harder and more impatient underneath, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your children and move to the front of the plane. We are 15 minutes from completing boarding, and I cannot have this aisle blocked." Ma'am, the word that is technically respectful and functionally its opposite. Your children. The framing that made Diane a complication to be managed rather than a passenger with rights. This aisle. As if the aisle were being blocked by the family rather than by the confrontation Carol herself had initiated. Diane heard all of it. She processed all of it. And she made a decision. She lowered her arm. Just slightly. The boarding passes dropped a few inches. And in the row behind her, Priya, the attorney from Decatur, made a very small sound. Not quite a word, not quite a protest. Just a breath that carried enough weight to be heard by the man in 15A, who glanced at her, and then at Diane, and then forward at Carol, and whose expression changed. Imani had stopped making Gerald wave. She was looking at her mother now. She didn't understand the words, not all of them, but she understood her mother's posture. She understood the stillness in it. She pressed Gerald against her chest and said, very quietly, "Mama." And it was that word, 7 letters, 2 syllables, a 7-year-old girl's voice in a quiet plane cabin. That did something to the atmosphere in the surrounding rows that nothing else had quite managed to do yet. Because you can theorize about fairness and bias and institutional behavior and the invisible weight that some families carry through the world. You can understand it intellectually, academically, from a comfortable distance. But there is something about a small child saying "mama" in that particular voice, the one that means "I'm scared," and "is everything okay," and I trust you to fix this all at once. That cuts right through every layer of abstraction and lands in your chest like something physical. The man in 15A stood up. He didn't say anything yet. He just stood up. It was enough. Carol noticed him standing. Her attention fractured for just a second, professional instinct pulling her toward potential turbulence from multiple directions. And in that second, Diane made her second decision of the morning. She sat down. Row 14A. Window seat. She sat down in it, smoothly and deliberately, and with absolute finality. The way you sit down when you want every single person watching to understand that you are not leaving. She turned to Marcus, who slid in beside her. She turned to Marcus and nodded slightly toward 14C, the aisle seat, and Marcus turned to Imani and held out his hand, and Imani took it and stepped in past him and sat down in 14B, and Marcus sat in 14C, and in approximately 6 seconds, all three of them were seated, buckled, and looking forward. The cabin was completely silent. Carol stood in the aisle looking at a family that was now seated, buckled, and showing every outward sign of having arrived exactly where they were supposed to be. "I need you to get up," Carol said. Her voice had changed again. The professional smoothness was almost entirely gone now. What was left was something personal. "We're in our seats," Diane said, without turning her head. "We'd like to speak with the captain." The word captain had an effect. Derek, who had been standing at the edge of the galley this whole time, trying to calculate how to exist in a situation he was not prepared for, took one step forward and then stopped himself. He looked at Carol. Carol was looking at Diane. The man in 15A was still standing. "The captain is preparing for departure," Carol said. "He is not available to." "With respect," said the man in 15A, and his voice was the pleasant baritone of someone who had been in enough meeting rooms to know how to project without seeming aggressive. "I've been watching this for several minutes now, and no one has actually looked at this family's boarding passes. Can we maybe start there?" Carol turned toward him. It was a specific kind of turn, not toward a passenger concern, but away from an opponent. The kind of pivot that signals you've been caught off balance and are trying to recover the ground. "Sir, I'd appreciate if you'd let airline staff handle this situation." "I'd appreciate it too," he said, easy and steady, "but the staff haven't handled it. They've just asked this family to leave." From 13B, Priya spoke for the first time. She didn't put her phone down. "She's been holding those boarding passes out for 6 minutes, she said. "I have it on video." The word video moved through the cabin like a current. 3 more phones appeared. Not hostile, not a mob, just witnesses deciding to be visible about the fact that they were witnesses. Carol's face did the thing that faces do when the situation has shifted faster than the person inside it has been able to track. The certainty flickered. A new calculation began. She had come into this expecting a particular kind of interaction, the kind she had perhaps had before, successfully, where her authority in the cabin translated cleanly into compliance from the family being questioned, where the other passengers either stayed neutral or silently supported the version of order she was enforcing, where the whole thing resolved quietly before anyone could look at it too closely. That was not what was happening. What was happening instead was a plane full of people who had watched a mother hold out her boarding passes for 6 minutes and never had them examined, who had heard a 7-year-old say mama in that particular voice, who had heard an 11-year-old say she hasn't looked at the tickets with the calm precision of a person who understood exactly what was happening and was naming it out loud so that everyone else would have to understand it too. What was happening was that Carol had asked for the room's silent agreement and discovered that the room had already decided. And now she was standing in an aisle with 6 cell phones recording and a family buckled into their confirmed seats, and no supervisor yet present, in a situation that had gone, in approximately 8 minutes, from something she had expected to control to something that was very clearly controlling her. She said, in a voice that was trying to reassemble itself into authority, "I'm going to call the supervisor now." "That's a great idea," Diane said. She still hadn't turned her head. Marcus, in the aisle seat, looked straight forward like a person who had all the time in the world. His hands were folded in his lap. His backpack was in the overhead. He had his seatbelt on. He looked, in that moment, like someone who had decided a long time ago exactly what kind of person he was going to be when moments like this arrived. And Carol walked back toward the galley to make the call, and the cabin began to breathe again, and Priya in 13B met eyes with the man in 15A across the aisle, and gave him a small nod that said, "We're doing the right thing here," and he nodded back and sat down. And Imani leaned her head against her mother's arm. And Diane, finally, allowed herself one long, slow exhale. But this was not over. Not even close. Because the supervisor was coming. And the supervisor was going to bring choices. And the choices were going to reveal things about this airline, about this morning, about the family in row 14, that nobody in that cabin was fully prepared for yet. Stories like this one exist because people refuse to stay quiet. If this channel is telling the stories that matter to you, subscribe right now. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means everything to a channel built on truth. Who stood out to you most in this act? Diane's composure, Marcus's words, Priya's recording, or the man in 15A who stood up? Tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest. ACT 4, the turning point. The supervisor's name was Raymond. He was a compact, careful man with a silver tie and the walk of someone who had spent years managing other people's crises and had gotten very good at projecting a neutrality, so practiced it was almost indistinguishable from indifference. He came down the aisle with a tablet in one hand and an expression on his face that said, "I've seen everything and nothing surprises me." And he stopped at row 14 and looked at Diane and said, "Ma'am, I'm Raymond, the cabin supervisor. Can I see your boarding documentation?" He asked to see it. First thing, before anything else. Diane looked up at him. Something in her eyes shifted, just a degree, just enough, and she handed him the boarding passes. He took them. He looked at them. He looked at his tablet. He looked at them again. The cabin waited. "These appear to be valid," he said. "Measured. Professional." "They are valid," Diane said. Carol, standing just behind Raymond's left shoulder, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Raymond looked at her, then back at his tablet. His expression had not changed. The professional neutrality was still in place, but something behind his eyes had shifted in the way that things shift when a person who is good at their job realizes that they have walked into a situation where someone else has already made the problems for them. "Can you walk me through what happened?" he said to Carol. And here is where it gets interesting. Here is where the story begins to turn in a direction that none of the passengers watching, not Priya, not the man in 15A, not Derek hovering at the edge of the galley, had quite seen coming yet. Because Carol began to explain. And as she explained, something became clear to everyone listening, something that is very familiar to anyone who has ever watched a narrative collapse in real time. The details that had seemed authoritative became vague. The certainty that had been in her voice at the beginning of the confrontation became something hedged and qualified and passive. The "these seats are taken" became "I observed some confusion about the seating," and the "you need to step off the plane" became "I suggested that the passengers clarify their booking at the gate." Words that meant something real had been replaced by words that could mean anything. Raymond listened. His face was neutral. His eyes were not. Priya, in 13B, had not stopped recording. She had, in fact, lowered her phone slightly so that it was less obvious, which meant she intended to keep going for a long time. The man in 15A, his name was Gerald, and yes, that was the same name as Imani's stuffed elephant, which is one of those coincidences that feels made up, but is documented, was listening with the focused attention of someone who had spent 22 years as a high school civics teacher and had a very clear framework for what was happening. Marcus was looking at Raymond. He had been looking at Raymond since the moment the supervisor came down the aisle, with the same evaluative attention he'd applied to Carol, but with a different quality to it. Less guarded, more curious, because Raymond had asked to see the boarding passes. That one thing, that small, obvious, correct thing that Carol had never done, had placed Raymond in an entirely different category in Marcus's assessment. Not good, necessarily. Not yet. But different. Possibly honest. Raymond finished listening to Carol. He looked at his tablet again. Then he looked at Diane. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, and the use of her name, her actual name, from the boarding pass, Whitfield, spoken with the normal emphasis of a professional who has simply read what's in front of him, had a strange effect on the energy in the surrounding rows. It was such a basic, ordinary thing, and it had been so conspicuously absent from everything Carol had said. "Ms. Whitfield, I apologize for the confusion. Your seats are confirmed. You're in the right place. Is there anything you need before we complete boarding?" A long pause. Diane looked at him. "An explanation would be a start," she said. Raymond nodded slowly. The nod of a man who knew this was a reasonable request, and was also calculating the cost of every possible response. "I understand," he said. "I'd like to look into this fully once we're in the air, if that's acceptable. I want to make sure we handle this properly." Another pause. Shorter this time. "That's acceptable," Diane said. Raymond nodded again. He turned toward Carol. Whatever he said to her, he said quietly, too quietly for the surrounding rows to catch more than the tone of it, which was even and low, and left Carol looking at the floor. Then Raymond walked back up the aisle. And Carol, after a moment that seemed to cost her something, though it was not clear what, moved away from row 14, back toward the galley. Without another word to the family, the cabin released another breath. And then something happened that nobody had planned or orchestrated or expected. The woman directly across the aisle, row 14D, who had not said a word the entire time, who had been quietly reading a novel with the focused energy of someone trying very hard not to look like she was listening to every word, put her book down, turned slightly toward Diane, and said, just loud enough, "Good for you." 2 words. That's all. But it was a match dropped on a surface that had been waiting. The man in 15A, Gerald, civics teacher, said, "She never looked at those passes. Not once." From 13B, Priya lowered her phone fully for the first time and said, "I got the whole thing." And somewhere in the rows further back, someone started clapping. Slow at first, uncertain, and then joined. Not a standing ovation, not a performance, just the sound of a plane full of people who had been watching something they recognized and were relieved to see it land where it did. Diane did not turn around. She looked out the window at the Atlanta tarmac, gray and busy in the early morning, and she pressed her lips together in a way that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, and she put her arm around Imani, who had no idea why people were clapping but decided it was good and clapped too, 3 enthusiastic times, which made the woman in 14D laugh despite herself. Marcus did not clap. He was still looking forward with that same steady composure, his hands in his lap, his seatbelt on. But something in his posture had changed, something very small, almost invisible, the difference between a person holding themselves completely rigid under pressure and a person who has allowed themselves, by a fraction, to let the pressure go. He looked, in that moment, like a boy, which is what he was, which is what he should have been able to be the whole time. But here is what nobody on that plane knew yet. Here is what Raymond knew, standing in the galley now, his tablet open and his eyes moving across a screen with an expression that was no longer professionally neutral. Here is what he had found in the boarding record, in the passenger profile, in the system that Carol had apparently never bothered to consult before she walked up to row 14. Diane Whitfield was not simply a passenger. She was, and had been for 9 years, a member of the airline's Platinum Elite tier. The top tier. The tier that represented fewer than 1% of the airline's frequent flyer membership. The tier that, according to the airline's own internal training documentation, was to be treated with a specific set of protocols that were, to put it mildly, the exact opposite of what had happened in rows 13 through 15 for the past 12 minutes. She had 387 flights on this carrier alone. 387. She had flown more miles on this airline than most of the staff had worked hours. But that wasn't even the thing that made Raymond stand in the galley with the expression of a man doing silent math that was not adding up in anyone's favor. The thing, the actual thing, the one that made him set his tablet down on the galley counter and pinch the bridge of his nose for just a second before recomposing himself, was the code in the system next to Diane Whitfield's name. A flag. A notation. The kind that gets added to a profile when a passenger has, in the past, filed a formal complaint with the airline's civil rights office. The kind of notation that is supposed to trigger an escalation protocol. The kind that is supposed to mean, handle with exceptional care. It was there. It had been there when Carol scanned the boarding gate. The system would have shown it. And Raymond was very, very good at his job, which meant he was very, very aware of exactly how much trouble was sitting in row 14. He looked up at Derek, who was watching him from across the galley. "Get me the captain," Raymond said quietly. Derek picked up the interphone. "I need you subscribed before the next act, because the captain is about to walk out of that cockpit, and when he does, everything changes. Don't miss it. Subscribe now." At what moment in this act did you feel the shift happen? When Raymond used her name? When he confirmed the seats? or when you found out about the Platinum Elite status? Let me know below. ACT 5, regret hits hard. Captain James Okafor had been flying commercial aircraft for 24 years. He was the kind of pilot who arrived an hour before his crew, did his own weather checks in addition to the official ones, and kept a framed photograph in his bag, not in the cockpit, just in his bag, of the first plane he ever flew solo, a single-engine Cessna over a green Ohio field on a summer morning when he was 19 years old. He kept it because on the hardest days, on the days when the weight of the job pressed down in ways that had nothing to do with altitude, he liked to remember that he had once been that person looking down at a green field and feeling like the whole world was open. He was a large, measured man with a deep voice and the kind of gravity that fills a room without demanding anything from it. His officers called him Captain Okafor. His crew called him Captain O. The airline had given him more commendations than any other pilot in the Atlanta hub. He came out of the cockpit with his jacket fully buttoned and his expression fully composed, and he walked down the aisle the way a person walks when they already know, at least in outline, what they're going to find. Raymond had briefed him in 30 seconds. 30 seconds was apparently all it took. He stopped at row 14. He looked at Diane. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, and his voice was quiet and full and without any of the practiced neutrality that Raymond had deployed. This was something different. This was a man who had decided, in the 30 seconds between the galley interphone and this aisle, exactly what kind of captain he was going to be right now. "I'm Captain Okafor. I want to personally apologize for what happened to you and your family this morning." The cabin was absolutely silent. Diane looked up at him. Her expression didn't collapse. She was too composed for collapse. But something behind her eyes softened in the way things soften when you have been braced for so long and something unexpectedly decent happens. "Thank you," she said. "Your seats are confirmed. Your booking is valid. You should never have been questioned." He paused, just slightly. "And your children should not have had to witness that." At the word children, Imani looked up at the very tall man in the nice jacket. He looked down at her with a smile that was genuine and uncomplicated, and the kind that adults offer children when they want them to understand that everything is okay. Imani decided he was probably fine. She held Gerald up briefly, as if introducing them. Captain Okafor, 24-year veteran, looked at the stuffed elephant and said, with full gravity, "Hello." Imani giggled. And in the aisle seat, something happened in Marcus's face that his mother had not seen in a long time. Something cracked open, just briefly, in the composure he had been maintaining with such care for the entire morning. Not tears, not quite, but the face a child makes when they have been carrying something heavy and an adult, a specific, trustworthy adult, has just, without making a big deal of it, quietly taken some of the weight. He blinked it away in a second, but it had been there. Diane saw it. She reached over Imani and put her hand on Marcus's arm. Just for a moment. Captain Okafor straightened and looked down the aisle toward the galley, where Carol was standing. He did not say anything to her, not in front of the cabin. But the look was enough, the particular look of a senior professional at a junior one who has created a significant problem, and Carol looked at the floor. Then he looked at the surrounding rows. At Priya, still with her phone in her hand. At Gerald, the civics teacher, in 15A. At the woman in 14D who had said good for you. At the rows further back where the scattered clapping had come from. "I appreciate the patience and the solidarity of everyone in this cabin," he said, in that full, quiet voice. "We will be departing shortly. I'll ensure Ms. Whitfield and her family are taken care of for the duration of this flight." He gave Diane one more look, direct, respectful, the look of a person acknowledging that what happened this morning was not nothing, and that he knew it was not nothing, and then he walked back up the aisle toward the cockpit. The door closed behind him, and then the cabin did something interesting. It talked. Not loudly, not chaotically, just the sound of people who have shared an experience and need to process it. The man in 15A said something to the woman in 15B. Priya leaned across the aisle to say something to the man in 14D's row. People were looking at their phones, not to record anymore, but to text, to type, to tell people what they had just seen. Derek came out of the galley. He stopped at row 14, and he didn't look at Carol, and he didn't look at Raymond, and he just looked at Diane and said, simply, "Can I get you and the kids something to drink before we take off?" His voice was a little uncertain, a little apologetic. Not performatively, just humanly. The way a person sounds when they didn't do the wrong thing and also didn't do enough of the right thing and are sitting with both of those facts. Orange juice would be great, Diane said. Done. He looked at Marcus. You? Marcus considered this with the full gravity he applied to most things. Do you have apple? We do. Apple, please. Derek looked at Imani. Imani was looking at him with the focused, evaluative attention of a 7-year-old who has not yet decided if this man is trustworthy. We have cookies, Derek offered. Imani's evaluation concluded immediately and decisively in his favor. It was, all things considered, a very small thing. Juice and cookies. But there was something about the normalcy of it, the ordinary, basic human decency of someone asking a child what she wanted and then going to get it, that was almost as powerful in its way as everything that had preceded it. Almost. Because what was coming next was not small. What was coming in the minutes before that plane pushed back from the gate was a conversation between Raymond and a phone number at the airline's corporate office in Dallas. A conversation that would result in a formal incident report being filed before they left Atlanta airspace. A report that would trigger an internal review, that would pull Carol's record, that would find, because records find things when people start looking, that this was not an isolated situation, that there were other reports, other families, other mornings, that what had happened to Diane Whitfield in row 14 was not a mistake or a misunderstanding or an isolated act of one person's biases on one difficult morning, that it was a pattern. In Priya's video, which she had already sent to herself and backed up to 2 cloud services before the plane even began to move, because she was a litigation attorney and she understood evidence, would, in approximately 72 hours, be viewed by 400,000 people on social media, then 2 million. Then it would be picked up by 3 major networks. Then a civil rights attorney in Atlanta whose name you would recognize would call Diane's number. But that was later. Right now, on the plane, in row 14, what was happening was much simpler. Imani had fallen asleep against Diane's arm, Gerald the elephant tucked under her chin. Marcus was reading. He had pulled a paperback from his backpack, something thick and serious-looking that was not assigned for school, because Marcus read ahead of his grade level the way some kids run ahead of the group, automatically, instinctively, without making a point of it. Diane was looking out the window again. The Atlanta tarmac was lit now by full morning sun. The plane was moving. Below them, the city was doing what cities do, continuing, indifferent, enormous, complicated. And Diane Whitfield, Platinum Elite, 387 flights, mother of 2, was sitting in seat 14A, the window seat she had booked 3 weeks ago, and allowing herself, for the first time since she had stepped onto this jetway, to feel something other than the particular controlled readiness she had needed all morning. It was not quite triumph. It was something quieter, something that had to do with the fact that she had not moved, that she had stayed, that she had asked to be treated like a person with rights, repeatedly, clearly, without flinching, and that the plane had, finally, agreed. She put her head back. She closed her eyes. Somewhere over the clouds, Marcus turned a page. If this story moved you, share it. Put it somewhere someone who needs it will find it. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to this channel right now. Truth-telling is what we do here. What was the moment in this act that hit you the hardest? For me, it was Marcus's face when the captain spoke. What was yours? ACT 6, the aftermath. The flight from Atlanta to its destination was 2 hours and 40 minutes. In that time, 3 things happened on the plane that mattered. The first was that Carol did not emerge from the galley for the first 40 minutes of the flight. When she did, she moved through the cabin with the careful, precise efficiency of someone performing a job with the full awareness that they are being watched. She made no eye contact with row 14. She did not speak to Diane or Marcus or Imani. She did her work. She was professional about it. But the authority was gone, not just diminished, gone, replaced by something that looked, from a distance, like a person quietly reckoning with the gap between who they had thought they were and what the morning had shown them. Whether that reckoning would turn into anything lasting was not something the passengers in rows 13 through 16 could know. Reckoning is private. Change is slow. The world is full of people who have their worst moments witnessed publicly and learn nothing from them. It is also full of people who do. Which one Carol would be was a question for a future that nobody on Flight 2247 could see into. But the question, at least, had been asked. The second thing that happened was that Priya came and crouched in the aisle beside row 14. She waited until Imani was asleep and Marcus was absorbed in his book, which gave her and Diane a sliver of the kind of semi-private space that airlines are not generally designed to provide. "I'm a lawyer," she said quietly. "Civil litigation, mostly employment. But I know people." She held out a card. Small, clean, just her name and a number. "I'm not pushing anything, but I want you to have this, in case you decide you want to do something with what happened this morning." Diane looked at the card for a long moment. Then she took it. "She's done this before," Diane said. It wasn't a question. Priya looked at her steadily. "That's what I'd want to find out." Diane nodded once. The slow, certain nod of a woman who had already begun, in the quiet of the past 2 hours, to make exactly this decision. "I'll call you," she said. Priya stood, straightened, and went back to 13B. The third thing was between Diane and Marcus. It happened near the end of the flight, when Imani was still asleep and the cabin lights had been lowered slightly, and the hum of the engines had settled into that particular frequency that makes people tell each other things they might otherwise not say. Marcus had put his book down. He was looking at the back of the seat in front of him with the focused gaze of someone who is not really looking at anything. "Mom," he said quietly. "Yeah, baby." A pause. Long enough that Diane turned to look at him. "I wasn't scared," he said. "Then, I was a little scared." Another pause. "But mostly, I just didn't want you to have to do it alone." Diane looked at her son. Her 11-year-old boy with his backpack and his serious book and his composure that was so much older than his years. Composure she had never asked him to develop. Composure he had developed anyway because the world had required it of him. And she felt something complicated and vast move through her. Pride. Yes. Always pride. But also something that lived right next to grief. The grief of raising a child who has already learned that the world will sometimes make him prove that he belongs in it. She put her arm around him. He leaned in. Just briefly. Just enough. "You didn't do it alone," he said into her shoulder. "You never do." Diane closed her eyes. Outside the window, the clouds broke and the landscape below, fields, roads, the geometry of ordinary American life, spread out in the afternoon light, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. She held her son, and she thought, "We are still here. We stayed. We didn't move." And that was enough. That was, in this particular moment on this particular plane, everything. When the plane landed, Captain Okafor made a point of standing at the cockpit door as the passengers deplaned. He shook hands with the man in 15A. He gave Imani a small pair of silver wings, the kind they give to children, and she accepted them with the gravity of someone receiving a medal, which, to be fair, is essentially what it was. He looked at Marcus. He held out his hand. Marcus shook it. "You handled yourself well today," the captain said. Marcus looked up at him. "So did you," he said. Captain Okafor smiled. It was a real one. He looked at Diane last. No words. Just a look that meant, "I see you. I'm sorry it came to this. I'm glad you stayed." She nodded. Once. It was enough between two people who understood exactly what the morning had cost and what it had returned. She walked off the plane into the bright, ordinary business of an airport on a weekday, her daughter on one side, her son on the other, and behind her the quiet, enormous machinery of consequence had already begun to move. The video, the report, the lawyer's card in her pocket, the record that was already being pulled in an office in Dallas. She didn't know all of that yet, but she walked like someone who had already decided that she was going to find out. This story is not over, and neither is this channel. Subscribe right now so you don't miss the follow-up, because what happened after that video went public is a story all its own. What do you think should happen to Carol? And what do you think actually will? Real talk. Drop your thoughts below. ACT 7. Powerful closing. There's a question underneath all of this. There's always a question underneath stories like this one. The kind of question that doesn't get asked out loud in the moment because the moment is too loud, too urgent, too focused on the immediate fight for the ground-level question to surface. The question is this. Why should it take a captain's apology and a platinum loyalty status and a video going viral and a litigation attorney in the next row for a family to be allowed to sit in the seats they paid for? Why should dignity require documentation? Why should belonging require proof? Marcus Whitfield is 11 years old. He sat in row 14C with his seatbelt on and his backpack in the overhead and his hands folded in his lap, and he said 6 words that cut through everything. She hasn't looked at the tickets. Not because he had been trained in conflict resolution or coached in de-escalation or prepared for this specific moment. He said it because it was true, and he could see that it was true. And he had already understood by age 11 that sometimes the most radical thing a person can do in a broken situation is simply and clearly name what is actually happening. The world does not make it easy to be 11 and black and watching your mother have to prove that she exists. But here is what Marcus Whitfield knows, because he has learned it not from textbooks, but from watching his mother move through the world with her printed boarding passes and her calm voice and her absolute refusal to become what other people's assumptions wanted her to be. Dignity is not given. It is not granted by supervisors or confirmed by captains or validated by standing ovations from passengers in rows 13 through 20. Dignity is what you already have. It is what you carry onto the plane before anyone checks your ticket. It is what you sit back down in when someone tries to take it away. It is what you pass to your daughter when she presses her head into your arm, and what you reach across and touch your son's arm to remind him of. It is the thing that was never in question, even when someone tried to make it a question. Diane Whitfield didn't win something on that plane. She kept something that was always hers. The world could use more people like the woman in 14D who said good for you. More people like Gerald, the civics teacher who stood up without being asked. More people like Priya who pressed record and stayed recording and knew exactly what to do with what she had. More people like Derek who came out of the galley and asked a little girl if she wanted cookies and meant it as an apology and delivered it as a kindness. And the world could use fewer mornings like this one. But until that morning comes, until the world gets there, which it will, slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly, humanly, there will always be a row 14. There will always be a family standing in the aisle with their tickets in their hand, waiting for someone to simply look. And there will always, hopefully, be people who do. Stay seated, Whitfields. You earned every mile. This story is dedicated to every family that ever had to prove they belonged somewhere they already paid for. You were never the problem. You were never the question. You were always the answer. If this story stayed with you, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications, and leave a comment with the one thing from today's story that you're still thinking about. Because the most important part of telling these stories is making sure they reach the people who need them. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.